right, so thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Erin Zimmerman for presenting today from the Writing Center on revising and editing long documents. So Dr. Zimmerman is going to discuss goals and strategies for revising, editing, and proofreading these long documents. That is all for me. I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Erin.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. Welcome. Hope boot camp is going well for everybody so far. I appreciate you joining me today. I will say that this is sort of a difficult topic to present on because everybody has their own particular writing processes. So when it comes to revising and editing, it's hard to sort of give, one size fits all strategies for folks because you all are revising and editing kind of at different stages along the ways that you're writing, or might prefer to do things in a particular way or not in that way, right? And, it can become really easy to just say like, oh, well, we'll just have a workshop on grammar, which nobody thinks is fun. So I've tried to create this presentation in such a way that it gives you a variety of tools and strategies that you can use and sort of help you think broadly about revising, editing, and proofreading. And then we will get into a handful of those sort of common mistakes that folks often make. And we'll just sort of see how far we get through them. So my PowerPoint is posted on Web Campus for you. So anything that we don't get, I've kind of put our later topics focused on grammar and sentence structure and mechanics kind of in order of priority. So sort of the bigger, more important things first, moving down to kind of like punctuation and things like that towards the end. So if there's anything that you sort of feel like, oh, I'm stuck with that, maybe check the presentation to see if it gets covered there in case we do run out of time. And I'll also say, I'm working from home today. My husband is painting in the room right next to me, and I have the door closed, so there might be cats crying, angry that they can't get in here. So if you're hearing background noise, I do apologize for that. There we go. So as I kind of mentioned, we sort of have two sections of this workshop. So goals and strategies really focused on how do you revise, edit, proofread, what kind of works well typically for folks. And then we'll sort of get into some of the common mistakes that people make. So part one. I think it's helpful to kind of start a little bit with the difference between or among these three parts of the writing process. So probably you all have heard at some point, maybe like in your freshman English classes, right? You talked about the writing process where you have maybe pre-writing or brainstorming that comes first, and then you draft and actually start writing the paper, and then after that comes revising, and then after that comes editing and proofreading. A lot of times the revising, editing, and proofreading get like grouped together, but for this workshop, let's kind of break them apart. I think it's a good idea to sort of look at them individually, and then you all can kind of take it and remold it and make it work for you, right? Like if it doesn't help to separate editing and proofreading in your mind, combine them, right? That's totally fine. But for now, let's kind of dissect it, and then you all can make it as useful for you in ways that work. So in terms of revising, the thing to consider when you're revising is sort of the whole paper, right? So that's why in that writing process, revising comes first, because these are the bigger picture kinds of issues in the paper. So we're talking about content at this point, maybe even like paragraph organization or sections, right? If you're writing a chapter for your dissertation, should this section come before that section, right? So revising, okay, thank you, Alyssa. So thinking about sort of these really big, important issues within the paper that focus more on the content, and is the content coming across to the reader. With editing, we're moving more focused, right, to sentence and paragraph level. And so there we're really looking at clarity. So are the sentences clear? Are the paragraphs clear? You know, there might be some content things, but more thinking about language, sentence structure, things like that. And then proofreading is really focused on those tiny little, like real nitpicky details. You have that like laser focus as you're reading through your paper to be like, oh, you know, the formatting here is wrong. I have an extra space between these two words, right? That's where proofreading really comes in, are just these teeny little details. So let's start with the most important, and we'll work our way to the more focused segments here. So in terms of revising, like I said, like this is where we're thinking about the content, perhaps like logic of organization. So some of the goals that you want to have in mind when you're revising, number one, are thinking about like, are you fulfilling the requirements or the goals, right? Is it doing what it needs to do, what you want it to do, or what your major professor wants you to do, perhaps? Thinking about the purpose, right? Is that purpose really being demonstrated? You know, is your main argument, is the claims that you're trying to really get your readers to understand, are they coming across? And so then again, thinking about structure, organization, sometimes we call this flow, making sure that our topics, we've covered them enough, but maybe we haven't like spent pages and pages and pages, and maybe, oh, we should cut back down ideas, things like that. Making sure that our sections are cohesive, right? That we see how every section, every paragraph is speaking to, you know, our thesis statement, or our main arguments, our hypotheses, and then we have those transitions working well, right? So some strategies to keep in mind when you're revising. And I'll say a lot of the strategies I'm trying to provide are ones that are more kind of like hands-on or visual. So of course, right, you can just read your writing and be like, oh, I noticed this, right? That's how a lot of us revise. But I wanted to sort of mix it up and offer some strategies that maybe you haven't thought about before, or that maybe kind of let you take a step back from just the text on the page. A lot of times, hopefully for you all, that I'm not the weird one, but I get so kind of focused on what I've written that it's hard for me to kind of like break away from it. It's like, no, it all looks good. And then somebody else is like, but what about that thing? And then suddenly I'm like, oh yeah, that's super obvious. How did I miss that? So I think in the same way, you can maybe take some of these strategies to kind of kick your brain out of just that focus and inability to sort of see past what you've written. So in terms of revising strategies, I have several here. So you might keep a checklist, right? So this often is easier for maybe folks who are working on a proposal, and maybe you have a document that lists out here all the things that need to appear in the proposal. You know, use that as a checklist. For a thesis or dissertation, you maybe don't have that, but maybe you could find some models of other theses or dissertations to get a sense of, you know, okay, what's coming where? Am I doing those same things? And create a checklist that way. You can read the topic sentence of each paragraph to see, does this paragraph actually talk about that particular thing that I've set up? Similarly, you can create a reverse outline, and that's where you summarize each individual paragraph just in a phrase or maybe a full sentence to say like, okay, this is what this paragraph discusses. This is what the next paragraph discusses. And that helps you get a sense of, do I have too much happening in this paragraph? is it clear what's coming across in this paragraph? Or maybe I need to move these paragraphs around because now that I've thought about it in outline form, it doesn't really make sense the way it's structured now. A lot of times you can also talk to somebody else, right? Explain things to them and maybe have them take a look at it. Or after you've explained, here's what, this section's doing, go back and look at that and be like, is that actually what it's doing? Maybe I could clarify some things. Because for most of us, we're more comfortable speaking than we are writing. So a lot of times we can articulate verbally our ideas much more succinctly than we do in our writing, and we can go back after we've talked through and double check our writing. And then you can use color codes, right? So maybe you go through and highlight, okay, here's where my claim is in one color and then in another color. Here's all the evidence I'm using to support that claim. Is it all there, right? And of course, if you're colorblind, you can come up with another kind of key and code, right? You can underline or draw stars or things like that, right? So all of these kinds of more hands-on, more visual, maybe audio verbal practices might be ways to sort of help you think through the revising stage where you're looking at the content to see, am I really explaining what I want to explain? Okay, so that brings us to editing. And so editing, we're looking more at sort of sentence level, maybe paragraph level types of issues, really kind of digging into language, so individual words or phrases. So your goals when you're editing, you'll want to break up really long sentences, really long paragraphs. It's just really hard for a reader to maintain focus, to remember, where did this paragraph start if suddenly, 2 pages later, I'm still in the same paragraph. We need, all of us as humans, as readers, we need breaks. We need to be able to pause. That's what paragraph breaks give us, and sentence breaks gives us a chance to sort of pause, make sure we comprehend what's being said before we move on to the next thing. So you can watch for that. You can also, in terms of thinking about lengthiness, you can reduce wordiness and jargon. You can make sure your word choice is accurate. You can kind of pay attention to tone, and we'll talk about tone a little bit more in a few minutes. And you want to make sure that you're using your source material responsibly. So at this stage, we're not thinking about like, are the formats of my citations correct? But am I integrating it well into the language, right? Do I have a clear introduction to the quote that I'm using, or is it clear that I'm paraphrasing this? Where is the text, or who is the author, right? Those kinds of things. So some strategies for editing. So you can read your paper aloud. This is often really helpful because you might realize, oh, that you're stumbling over words or you're not able to get to the end of the sentence in the same breath, right? That might mean it's too long, or it might mean that some of the words that you're using are maybe kind of out of order, or things like that. You can look for any vague words, maybe do like in Microsoft Word, you can do find, right? And search like, okay, I realize that I have a tendency to say this word a lot. I say very a lot, and very, it maybe isn't really a word that I want to use because it's not super descriptive. How much is very? Very is very, right? So, right, I could find very and go through and decide, like, do I really need all of those? Or can I, so if I don't need them, maybe I delete them, or can I change them to a more precise word? You can sort of skim through and again, like, find any technical words, any sort of jargon. And not that jargon is bad, right? Especially at the level that you all are writing, but have you defined those terms, right? Not all of your readers all across the board are going to know all of the terminology that you're using. So is it something you need to define? If so, where did you do that? Or do you need to do that now? So again, you can highlight or underline really long sentences. One of the things I often have my students do if they come across a really long sentence or a really long paragraph is I kind of make it a competition and like, oh, okay, so this sentence is 50 words long. Try and cut it down to 25, what can you do? And of course that takes a little bit of time, but sometimes it sort of like re-energizes you after you've been sitting there writing for a while and you're tired, to bring in a little bit of competition to yourself of like, can I make this happen? How do I do it? Right? Got to solve this puzzle. So something like that can sometimes be a nice little, almost a break for you. And then think about paraphrasing. So for some folks, depending on their field, you really probably aren't quoting at all, or very, very rarely, right? For other folks in other fields, you might be quoting more. But if you're kind of noticing like, man, that's a really long quote, or man, this paragraph is really long, how could I make it more concise? Paraphrasing can often help you do that. So just something perhaps to watch out for a little bit. All right, so then that brings us to proofreading. So proofreading is, like I mentioned, is like really that laser focus when people talk about like, oh, you've got to be super detail oriented. That's where proofreading comes in to play, because you're really looking at sort of the presentation of the document on the page and these really, really small details. So this is where like maybe you spelled something wrong, maybe you have a comma when you need a period somewhere, maybe there's a minor grammar, you used their THERE instead of their THEIR. There might be some format inconsistencies. Maybe you've got some bullets that, kind of shot over too far on the page, or some of your headings are maybe formatted at the wrong level that they need to be. And then other design elements. So those of you doing theses and dissertations, right? Like the library has very specific like page layout guidelines for you, table guidelines, font choices, things like that. Sometimes I do see, for instance, like if you copy something from a source or even from maybe a Google Doc into a Word document, right? The font shifts. So being careful of those kinds of things. That's what we're looking for with proofreading. So some proofreading strategies. Watch for, like in the text editor, any recommendations. A lot of times we'll see like squiggly lines underneath, or the words or sentences get highlighted for us. So pay attention to those, right? They're not always correct. Microsoft Word often is telling me this is wrong. And I'm like, no, it's not. Thank you. So keep that in mind, but do pay attention to any times you see sort of those notations that are there for you. You might put your writing into a text-to-speech app and have it read back to you. So in the same way, previously I said, you can read aloud to yourself. For some folks, it's actually more helpful to hear their writing read back to them. So, of course, you could always find a really nice friend or family member who wants to read your dissertation out loud to you. But if you don't want to bother other folks, there are plenty of apps out there that will do this. And so sometimes that will help catch even just little misspellings and things like that. I've had many students where like, autocorrect in Google Docs or Microsoft Word autocorrected to the wrong word and they just missed it, right? So a lot of times something like that could happen. I mentioned before the find function to locate words. Here you can do the same for punctuation marks. So you can do find and like search for every place you've got a colon, maybe, because maybe you're not sure about how to use colons. So that can be useful for you. I would say, I mentioned before, like finding models. Definitely, if you have not done this, highly recommend doing this, going and finding some theses or dissertations at the library, preferably students who have worked with your advisor or members of your committee, to look at how have they organized the sections in their chapters, how have they, formatted particular elements, right? It's always easier to have a guide, right? You don't need to make this up. Many people have written theses and dissertations before you. Many people are going to come after you. You're not the only one. Use the ones that have come before you as resources. So if you're doing that, look at the style, right? So look at, okay, the citations, do my citations match theirs? Does everything sort of look okay, right? So any of those kind of document elements that you're a little unsure about, you can go and use some of those published theses or dissertations to kind of compare. And then I often will print my documents when I'm doing editing and proofreading, just to look at the page sort of in a different medium. For me, I find that I catch more if I'm reading the physical page and kind of handwriting on it. Of course, that's not the same for everybody, but I do think, maybe play with the medium to see if that's something that works well for you or not. But in particular, I suggest printing your reference page, right? Because your in-text citations, every in-text citation that you have in your paper needs to be on your reference page. And every citation that's on your reference page needs to also be in your text somewhere. So that's a way for you maybe to have your reference page printed, and then you can look through the document on the computer to make sure, okay, yep, every single one is there, right? Oh, wait, maybe I'm missing this one. Do I need that one to be there, or should I delete it, right? And get that all figured out. So then here, just some kind of suggestions before we move into sort of the error part of the presentation. Just some things to help you keep track of your work, right? So the first one is one that I'm sure you've heard over and over and over and over, but save frequently and back up your work. And I know that you've heard horror stories, but I too, I lost part of my dissertation because I had it on a flash drive. My cat knocked my laptop off the desk and it broke the flash drive. So thankfully I didn't lose a whole lot, but I lost, like probably 15 to 20 pages worth of writing. So save frequently in multiple places. Like superheroes, do not let those things die. So you'll be annoyed at how often you have to save things, but you will just be brokenhearted if you lose a whole bunch of your work. If you're using Google Docs or a text editor like that, I think excuse me, also some versions of Microsoft Word will do this, where you can go back and see your version history, right? But if you're not doing that and you have multiple drafts, it can be helpful to make sure that if you're using different files, you're dating your drafts like in the file name, so that you don't get confused and end up going and working on an older draft. Also, I think if you're deleting things out of your drafts, having those saved history versions can be helpful, because I know there were times where I was like, I don't need this, I'm deleting it. And then, 7 or 8 days later, I'm writing about something else. And it's like, that would have fit here, but it's gone. So do sort of keep track, even of things that maybe you're discarding, which leads me to the next section, or the next item here, which is to save discarded sections. Any little bits and pieces of things where you're like, maybe here's a good idea, or I wrote this and it just doesn't work here. I need to get rid of it here. Maybe I can use it later. Have a way in your files, or in whatever apps you're using, programs you're using, to kind of keep those things so that you have them, right? It's better to have them and not use them than to get rid of them and need them. You know, our brains are firing in lots of different ways as we're writing, and in our lives around all the times that we're writing, and we often, you know, dream at night these great ideas and wake up and it was like, what was that again? So keep track. So use the comment function to leave yourself notes, right? This can be a way for you to maybe like keep some of those discarded sections, maybe places where you just kind of want to leave a reminder to yourself. You know, maybe some things that you're like, I'm not sure about this, but maybe I'll use it later, right? That can often, the comment function, having those bubbles off to the side of the page, can often be a helpful way for you to keep track of some of the things that you've got in your brain, or not lose some of the work that you've done, that you're just not sure if it fits or not. Definitely use color codes, create a key, you know, for any sort of system. With this in particular, I'm thinking of like when you're writing a literature review, right? And you've got a whole bunch of resources, a whole bunch of sources that speak to a particular topic, and then you've got a whole bunch of sources that speak to another topic, right? Color coding can often be useful, whether it's, you know, the highlighter that you're using to, or the sticky notes that you're using, or if you have like a document where you're keeping track of all your citation bibliographies, those kinds of things. Sometimes color codes can just sort of help you stay organized. And then finally, creating a summary and purpose outline. And a summary and purpose outline is basically, you're not outlining every paragraph like in a reverse outline, or but more of kind of a formal paragraph, or sorry, a formal outline in the way that we've kind of been taught, like through grade school, where it's like, you know, okay, so here's main idea 1, here's main idea 2, main idea 3, main idea 4, right? And that can just sort of help you look back through everything and make sure, okay, you've got everything really kind of organized, nothing's irrelevant, nothing's unnecessary. We've got this that can be moved out and saved somewhere else, or this needs to be put back in. But it just lets you know, okay, the job that I've been trying to do is what I am in fact doing. All right, that leads us to the expectations that readers have for you and common errors that folks make. And so, I mean, I think my number one suggestion for everything that I'm about to share with you is to really pay attention when you're reading other research in your field, because again, you can model what you are doing on what others have already done before you. And that kind of reading is also, especially if you start to pick up on, okay, here's something I struggle with, whether it's, you know, a particular convention for tone, or whether it's, you know, how to use semicolons, right? Like you can start sort of paying attention to those things and like, how do these other writers use these? And that can really guide you as you're working yourself. So, all right, let's talk about tone. Like I said, the errors we're going to talk about, I'm kind of focusing on sort of the bigger ones, and then the smaller, more like hyper-focused kind of punctuation ones are coming later. So we'll get through as much as we can. I probably won't go right up to 3 o'clock just because There's only so much like grammar and mechanics that people can handle at a time, and I feel like 20 minutes feels like a good solid amount. So tone is defined as the general character or attitude of a work, right? Sure, whatever. Character of the work. But so tone is typically influenced by word choice and structure. So what we mean when we think about tone for academic writing is that as writers, we have a particular purpose and we have a particular audience. And we want the language and the structure that we're using to really fit those two things. So usually what we want to strive for is more formal language. We're not just like, hey, y'all, what's going on today? That would be inappropriate. We're looking for really direct language, right? We're not sort of talking around the subject, hinting at the thing, but saying, this is it, right? Here is the evidence for what I found. It's very factual. We need to try to be consistent. So whether that's consistency in the arguments that we're making, or whether that is consistency sort of at the level even of like verb tense, right? Consistency throughout. And then that we're really being objective, right? We're trying to take, I mean, of course, like every piece of writing we write, especially when we're thinking about our own research, has some subjectivity to it. But we're trying to be objective in the sense that this is what we found, and this is how it fits within the broader conversation of the field, right? So some things to pay attention to with tone. First person pronouns. So for some folks in some fields, it's okay to say things like I and we. Other folks, it's not, right? So know what's appropriate for your field. And this is, again, where reading comes in, right? If other folks are doing it, it's probably okay. If nobody's doing it, stay away. So is it okay for you to say in the study we examine, or should you say this study examines, things like that? Another thing to pay attention to with tone that I think a lot of folks often forget about, and that's super important, especially in these longer documents that you all are writing, is to signpost. So to give, all what we call signposts, so directions for the reader to know what's happening. So that we understand how connections are being made. So here we have, for example, right? So we know what came before that. We don't know exactly what this writer wrote, but we know that they've given us some sort of maybe concept or material, right? And now they're giving us an example of that. And then we have however, right? Okay, so now we're contrasting something. This thing happened, and now we're getting something in opposition. So signposts can even be things like first, second, third, right? When we're sharing maybe pieces of evidence, or materials that we've used, right? But sometimes just really simple words or phrases help the help the reader make sure that they know precisely what it is that you're writing about, right? Which again helps you be factual, helps you be objective, helps you be very clear. So things to avoid when it comes to tone. So you probably should not use second person pronoun you when you're writing in academic writing. There might be places for you to do that, right? So nothing that I'm saying here is like absolutely no way, never. But things that typically we don't see unless you see it happening in your field, and it's okay. So typically you're not going to use you. You're typically not going to use any contractions. So this is where, right, like in Microsoft Word, find, and you look for the apostrophe, and you can go through and see, okay, where am I using the apostrophe to show a possessive noun? And it's apostrophe S where it's appropriate, and where have I written can't, and I need to change that to cannot, right? Informal colloquial language, right? Sometimes this is harder for us to sort of pick up on, but again, the more we're reading, the more we're writing, the more in tune we sort of are to recognize when we type something, it's like, yeah, okay, that sounds too informal. Let me go back and reword it. Watching out for hyperbole. So I used the example very before. Sometimes very can be hyperbole. I was very excited, right? Well, you can just be excited. Do you need to be very excited? So words like always, words like obvious, words like unique are very extreme, right? How do you prove something always happens? How do you prove that this characteristic is unique to, this one group and to no one else ever, right? So watch out for those kinds of things. Make sure that you're qualifying when you need to. Watch out for emotive language. So especially if you're talking about sort of or if you're working in fields, particularly where you're dealing with people and you're trying to show results to maybe the general public that maybe are harsh, right? Or also like really great things like it's heartbreaking when this happens, right? Be careful of language like that. Try and remain again more objective. Try not to bring your feelings into it or feeling language. And then beware of any kind of generalizing. And this is something probably at your stage, you're really recognizing if you're doing this. But sometimes there are ways that we're doing it that we just don't quite catch, right? In the same way that maybe we say, oh, this thing is obvious. And it's like, well, it's not obvious to everybody. That we might actually be sort of generalizing in ways that are unhelpful. So that's next we'll talk about inclusivity just a little bit. So inclusivity is kind of dealing with word choices that indicate who the author's envision of their audience. Right. So in academic writing, we want to make sure we're being fair and unprejudiced and not offensive. And I think more and more, right, we're in tune with inclusive language than probably even 10 or 15 years ago. But be aware of when to use gender neutral options. You maybe are using third person plural as a singular, right? That you're using their as a singular pronoun. That being said, some fields, I believe, still use, his/her. So again, be reading and sort of know the expectations in your field. Beware of any kind of defaulting to the dominant demographic. All participants were American versus all participants were from the United States, right? Canadians and Mexicans are North American. We got a whole bunch of countries in Central America, a whole bunch of countries in South America who are also American, right? So be careful about some of your language when it comes to kind of grouping people together. And then avoid language that demonstrates a lack of respect or understanding. So terms like illegal aliens, right? We sort of avoid language like that now. Now we would say undocumented workers. And this is the part where sometimes we get a little stuck because language is always changing, right? And so terms that get used that maybe even got used 5 years ago sort of are not really appropriate to use anymore. But that's definitely something to check with your major professors about if you have any questions about language that you're using. So concision is often important. You all are writing really long documents, so you might just be feeling like it's kind of not important to be concise. But when it comes to your individual sentences, it still can be really important to make sure that you're really letting your readers comprehend the main ideas that you want them to. If your sentences are sort of long and convoluted, we often can lose that thread. So don't let that happen. So when it comes to concision, this is about making your writing straightforward, deliberate, and effective, like I mentioned, particularly at the sentence level. So yes, this is when you can cut out words, maybe rephrase sentences or phrases that just aren't really working. Maybe you're vague, maybe you're unnecessary. So I've got a couple slides here to give you some examples. But so with concision, looking for vague words and adding in more specific words. So in the first example, the poll results demonstrate the various and different ways, right? Versus they demonstrate 6 distinct ways. Just that change, suddenly it's like, oh, okay, yeah, now we know exactly how many, right? So beware of repetition. This is something that, again, sort of reading it aloud can often help you catch. So the example here, events in past history that cause massive societal change are most often an unexpected surprise to almost everyone. So you can definitely kind of cut some of the repeated ideas here, right? History shows that revolutionary events are usually unexpected, right? So, right, we have the same idea, just much, much more concise. Being aware of placeholders. So again, another place that maybe you're using the find function. Instead of there are many causes of poverty, they include the many causes of poverty include. So there are is probably one of the larger, more popular placeholders, but sometimes you can find other ones. You want to, if you can, eliminate nominalizations. This is a word none of us use very often. But so what that means is when you have a verb or an adjective that's functioning as a noun in the sentence. So you don't need to know that, but just in case it's helpful, that's the definition of nominalization, a verb or adjective being used as a noun. So here we see the court's decision is dependent upon versus the court's decision depends on, right? So very slight, but the second one makes this clearer. We've taken out that strange nominalization, that strange sort of language there. And then any place that you find phrases that you can swap out for single words due to the fact that can just become because, right? So obviously, a lot of these, can only just show you one example. It's hard to say like, here are all the different ways that you could condense a phrase into one word. So that's why, sort of having a workshop and presenting on these things gets to be difficult because I can only provide so much for you. And really now you have to sort of take that away and apply it to your own writing. But hopefully a lot of that sort of at least gives you some ideas of like, okay, things that you tend to do when you write that maybe you can pay attention to. So let me talk quickly about active and passive voice and then verb tenses. And I think we'll stop after that and I'll just leave the punctuation stuff for y'all to just take a look at later on your own. I think it's fairly straightforward. I don't think you need anything really like clarified with that. So active versus passive voice, this may also be something that you have come across a good bit already, but paying attention to the conventions in your field with this is super important. So with active voice, the subject of the sentence is what's doing the action. And that typically means that an active sentence is more concise than a passive sentence. And social science and humanities research tends to, again, not always, but tends to value active voice. Passive voice, the subject of the sentence receives the action. It's not the subject doing it, but the subject receiving it. And so typically that's a little less concise, and it's often more valued in STEM fields, but this is changing. I'm starting to see more and more where writing in STEM is kind of moving away from that. And again, there are, these are both completely valuable ways of writing. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong, but there's a place and a time to use them. And one or the other tends to be valued a little bit more in certain fields. So just worth watching for. So with active voice, again, it's the subject that's doing the action. And so the importance is placed on that person or that group, right? Researchers surveyed, tobacco companies rejected, versus passive voice, where the subject is receiving the action and the importance is placed on more kind of on the on that piece of it, right? On the action itself. So teachers were surveyed, right? Instead of researchers surveyed teachers. Teachers were surveyed. We don't know by who, right? The hypothesis was rejected. Okay, so slightly different. It still means the same thing ultimately, but phrased differently. All right, so verb tenses in academic writing. So we're getting more and more sort of hyper focused into smaller and smaller kind of mechanical issues here. But I think there's some things about using verb tenses in academic writing that tend to be a little more conventional than maybe we think. So I wanted to make sure we got to this section quickly. So again, what I'm telling you here is not 100% all the time, but typically the verb tenses that are used in these particular sections, these particular sections, we tend to see these verb tenses, right? So simple present verbs are often in the introduction, the literature review, the methods, the discussion, and the conclusion. So it's kind of happening everywhere. Simple past, we're not seeing that so much in the conclusion, but we are seeing it in the results. We don't really see present tense happening in the results because we're talking about things, that we found in the past. But past tense, that's where we're talking about that. Present perfect, we might see in the literature review and in the conclusion, but we don't see that a whole lot everywhere else. So let me just sort of quickly go through what each of those kind of look like, just to give you a better sense. So simple present is used to discuss things in the present, not surprisingly, right? So things like facts, implications, further research, right? So we see some examples here. Insulin and glucagon regulate blood glucose levels. This happens, it's a fact. An elevated glucose level indicates a lack of glucagon hormones in the pancreas. Implication, this thing indicates this thing. Further research. Further studies about glucagon receptors are needed, right? Simple past tense used to discuss moments or events that occurred at a particular time or place, right? So that's sort of different from what's about to come. So actions that have occurred. Protocol X was used to analyze the data, right? The researchers used it at this time to do this thing in the past. And then present perfect are discussing events that sort of happens maybe at different times we don't really know exactly, maybe happened over a span of time, maybe even are happening up to this point in time. So here we see, right, actions that occurred or are still occurring. Many studies have focused on glucagon as an important regulating hormone, right? Many studies over a lot of time, maybe up until now, right, have focused on this versus what we saw before, which was, this protocol X was used at this time, right? So slight difference there. And then just some common verb mistakes sort of related to those. Sometimes writers will use present perfect when simple past is needed, right? So that difference between it happened at a particular time versus it happened sort of in an amorphous time. Researchers have collected multiple samples over time versus these researchers collected multiple samples at a particular time. So again, thinking about sort of clarity there, like which meaning is accurate. And then sort of the opposite, using simple past for something that's ongoing when present perfect maybe is needed. These results led to a deeper understanding, or these results have led to a deeper understanding, right? Very minor difference, but sometimes can be really important between it happened particularly with these results in this particular time, or this is ongoing, right? We're still figuring out what these results mean for us. And then sometimes using past tense for something that is general fact. So female graduate teaching assistants experienced disproportionate amounts of gaslighting in the past. That does not happen anymore, versus they experience disproportionate amounts of gaslighting that is happening more sort of present, like it is factual, it is taking place, right? Okay, so that brings us to just the punctuation stuff. So I've got stuff in here on colons, if that's helpful for you, semicolons, when to use single quotation marks versus the double quotation marks. And then some stuff on using punctuation and capitalization, especially if you're using quotes in your sources, from your sources. But yeah, so take a look at those if you feel like they'd be helpful for you. But just some final thoughts. So revision is a recursive process. And so what we mean by that is it's happening at different points. It's sort of ongoing through your process. So you might have to read through your paper, multiple times, or sections of your paper multiple times. Do try and find checklists, any kind of prompts, any kinds of instructions, any kind of models that you can use as a checklist as you're going to kind of keep track of information and check off to show, yes, I've done that. Reading aloud, super helpful. I highly recommend that, again, whether you read aloud to yourself or whether you have an app or a friend read it aloud to you. Start with revision. You don't want to sit down and change all your punctuation and fix all your misspellings and get your language all right and then realize I got to delete that whole paragraph anyway. It just doesn't work, right? You've now wasted a whole bunch of time. So start with the bigger things and move to the more minor things. So again, whether you break revision, editing, and proofreading into 3 separate steps, you don't necessarily have to do that, but focus on the bigger, more global, more important things before those like minor, hyper-focused, detail-oriented things. And then if you get stuck, please schedule a Writing Center consultation. We also have a handful of handouts on revising, on editing, and on proofreading that probably offer some different strategies than what I have offered here that might be helpful for you. Writing Center consultants will also read aloud to you, or if you're, stuck on, these sentences I cannot get them organized. They just sound funny, right? A lot of times we can help with those sorts of things. And then finally, I'll just say too that a lot of the strategies that I've offered for revising, editing, and proofreading through this, feel free to like adapt them, move them around. You know, maybe I offered one for proofreading that you're like, that would actually help me revise. Cool. Use it. Definitely make all of those your own in ways that are useful for you. So, all right, I will stop there. I don't know if folks have questions, or if you just want to get back to writing.
Well, thank you so very much, Erin. Always such a great workshop and so useful, especially for those in these long, long projects. We are, we do have another workshop right after this, but we have a couple minutes if anyone does have a question for Erin. I'm going to turn off the recording now so that we can start that up again for our next workshop.